Tonight on Ukraine Today, massive explosions across Russia. Ukrainian drones hit defense plants in Moscow and other regions. A historic deal. Ukraine and the UK agreed on the delivery of over 5,000 air defense missiles. Trump's big Russia statement. What will the president say this coming Monday? Stalin's ghost returns. Russia brings back labor camps. Taiwan on edge. China rapidly boosts its military power. How it is all connected to Russia's war in Ukraine. All this and more right now. Hi there, my name is Volodymyr Robchun. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's get to the news. Massive explosions in Russia. Ukrainian drones hit multiple defense factories, including targets near Moscow. Among them, plants that produce precision-guided weapons, MLRS, air defense systems, firearms, and, of course, drones and drone components. One of the key targets was the Lukhovetsky aviation plant, where MiG-29 and MiG-31 fighter jets are built and modernized. Russia's so-called Ministry of Defense claims it shot down 155 drones over 10 regions and over temporarily occupied Crimea. Russians struck a maternity hospital in Kharkiv. They used drones. A dental clinic, a school and several apartment buildings were also hit. There are reports of injuries. Sumy and Mykolaiv also came under attack. Later, the enemy hit Odessa, this time targeting a residential district. 8 people were injured. A local stable was also damaged. Reports say several horses were killed or badly injured. In June 2025, Russia killed 232 civilians in Ukraine. That's according to the UN monitoring mission, the highest number in 3 years of full-scale war. Over the past 6 months, civilian deaths have increased by 17%, civilian injuries by 64%. And in June 2025, Russia launched 10 times more missiles and drones than it did in June 2024. In the past 24 hours alone, Russia has lost at least 1,040 troops, killed and wounded. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, that's now 1,031,620 Russian soldiers. Ukrainian defense forces also destroyed 2 Russian tanks, 7 armored vehicles, 23 artillery systems and dozens of other enemy assets. Putin now wants an army of 1.5 million soldiers. Right now he has 1,200,000. That's according to President Zelensky, who spoke to reporters in Rome. He said the Kremlin plans to spend $300 billion on the war next year, and Putin wants to drag it out. But Zelensky added there are positive signals that US military aid is coming back.
It's important that after very constructive and very positive talks with President Trump, we now have all the necessary political signals about resuming aid deliveries. Our teams are already working to make sure everything arrives in Ukraine on time. And yes, we agreed on that. We also discussed with our partners the possibility to purchase more weapons, both in Europe and in the United States. We shared the details of that package with our friends, and we're hoping for their support. It includes air defense systems and missiles for the Patriots, the Patriot systems themselves and other systems, as well as artillery and other types of weapons that will strengthen the Ukrainian army.
I think I'll have a major statement to make on Russia on Monday. Those are the words of Donald Trump speaking to NBC. What kind of statement? We don't know. Trump didn't say. But let's think. I don't believe Trump can afford to admit that he failed to strike a deal with Putin. Why? Because that would mean that the man who wrote the art of the deal failed to make the deal. Also, I doubt Trump wants to distance himself from the war entirely. There are too many factors. His ego, one of them. So what will he say? I think it'll be something we have heard before, but with more pressure on the Kremlin. Something like, I'm very disappointed with Russia and Putin. They let me down, so now we're talking sanctions. Let's wait and see. And in the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments. And by the way, Trump may introduce 500% tariffs on Russian energy. That would be a total disaster for Russia's economy. More on that in just a moment.
Sanctions that break bones. That's how US Senator Lindsey Graham described the bill that could change the rules of global energy trade and deal a blow not only to Russia but also to its largest buyers. First and foremost, these are, of course, China and India, which today account for about 70% of Russia's exports of oil, gas, and uranium.
The goal of this bill is to break the vicious cycle in which China, a communist dictatorship, buys oil from Putin's Russia at below market prices, giving his war machine the means to kill innocent Ukrainian civilians.
The document has already received support in the US Senate and could be approved in the coming days. It provides for the introduction of 500% tariffs on the import of oil, gas, and uranium from Russia for all countries that continue to trade with it. The only exception will be for those who simultaneously provide both military and economic support to Ukraine. In effect, the United States is offering its partners the choice: either break ties with Russian energy resources or face a devastating blow to their own foreign trade. In the case of China, which purchases millions of barrels of oil daily, this is a challenge of strategic proportions.
I do not rule out the distinct possibility that Donald Trump may indeed announce such significant steps specifically and formally announce a theme after the relevant and appropriate law is passed, following the relaxation of certain regulations that would effectively give the president the explicit right, but certainly not the absolute obligation to impose the corresponding and necessary sanctions. And obviously here, Trump can act following a recent example, as he announced as well. For instance, he might say that tariffs will be imposed in a month and give that month as an opportunity to conduct negotiations and negotiation process, thereby encouraging China to put pressure on the Russian Federation in order to end the active phase of the war.
Trump and his inner circle have run out of patience. They were counting on one thing, both Moscow, the negotiators, including Dmitriev, Ushakov, Lavrov, and Putin himself all promised one thing, talked about one thing, but it turned out completely differently. In this case, Trump doesn't like that he was made to look like a weakling and a clown running errands for Putin. A person who has been fed so many lies, Putin and his entourage, have hung kilos of this noodle on his ears, of course, feels humiliated and wants to change the situation. For him, this is, of course, a reputational blow.
But is Trump really ready to move from words to action? According to the politician, the 47th President of the United States does not object to the law, but sets a condition: no microcontrol from Congress. The White House insists on preserving exclusive presidential powers, including the right to unilaterally lift sanctions.
In the current version, the president's foreign policy decisions will be subject to microcontrol by Congress through a joint disapproval procedure. This is unacceptable to us, stated one of the US officials.
If a compromise is reached, America will gain a powerful lever of pressure on Putin and everyone who trades with him.
We will see a drop in the ruble exchange rate, possibly by 5 to 10 rubles, maybe more, against the US dollar. But this is situational, and the rate will recover. The same applies directly to the stock market, but in the stock market, I think the changes will be even more significant, since if Trump is able to impose 500% tariff specifically on buyers of Russian energy resources, this will directly hit the energy sector and the capitalization of the relevant specialized companies. That is, the capitalization of energy companies will be seriously undermined. Therefore, in this case, of course, from an economic standpoint, there are significant risks directly for the Russian Federation. Even from the threat, the real threat of introducing such restrictions, not to mention their actual implementation.
And indeed, the Russian financial market is already reacting At the close of trading on the 9th of July, the Moscow Exchange Index plummeted to 2,696 points, the lowest level since early April. The drop for the day amounted to more than 2% and capitalization decreased by 140 billion rubles. Shares of the largest companies, Gazprom, Lukoil, Rosneft, Magnit, Montana S, Aeroflot ended up in the red. And while overseas they are only discussing sanctions, Russia is already feeling their effects through losses on the stock exchange, investor panic, and threats to the export model. But the main blow is still ahead.
Back to that same NBC interview, Trump also said he made a deal with NATO on US weapons for Ukraine. According to him, NATO will fully pay for the weapons and handle the logistics, including with Patriot systems. We are watching this story closely. Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share this video if you think it's worth it. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has announced the launch of a flagship fund to rebuild Ukraine. She made the announcement at the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Rome. The fund will include support from Italy, Germany, France, Poland and the European Investment Bank, and will focus on energy, transport and other critical Ukrainian sectors.
I remember very well the first Ukraine Recovery Conference 3 years ago. It was just a few months after Russia unleashed destruction and bloodshed on a scale not seen since the Second World War. I remember the pain of the Ukrainian people. But even more vividly, I remember just how quickly they picked themselves up and began to rebuild. In the liberated towns of Irpin and Bucha, and with restored homes, schools and hospitals. And Europe has been there at your side from day one on, and Europe will be at your side as long as it takes.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Italy is ready to help rebuild Odessa. Germany wants to invest in expanding drone production in Ukraine. That's according to President Zelensky after meeting with Italy's Prime Minister Meloni and German Chancellor Merz. And since we're talking about Merz, let's hear what he said at the Ukrainian Recovery Conference in Rome. The German Chancellor addressed both dictator Putin and President Trump.
I have two messages. The one goes to Moscow and to President Putin. The message is quite simple. We will not give up. And dear friends, my second message goes to Washington, D.C. and to President Donald Trump. Stay with us and stay with the Europeans. We are on the same page, and we are looking for a stable political order in this world. We are both, the Americans and the Europeans, are partnered with us. Stay with us on this side and on this page of our common history.
The United Kingdom has announced a historic agreement with Ukraine to deliver over 5,000 air defense missiles. This is part of a 19-year loan worth over $3 billion. And on top of that, the UK has pledged another $350 million in aid over the next year. Meanwhile, in Putin's Russia, Stalin's labor camps are back. The Kremlin wants to use them to torture captured Ukrainians and punish Russian dissidents. More in our next story.
The FSB is reclaiming its prison empire. Now, de jure, several laws are awaiting Putin's signature at once, which create colossal opportunities for the security service in modern Russian history. One of the documents allows for the construction of a new network of prisons and detention centers, a kind of Gulag Archipelago 2. All of this has happened before, but in the 1990s, after the collapse of the USSR and Russia's entry into the Council of Europe, the Kremlin tried to mimic a civilized state governed by the rule of law. At that time, places of detention and imprisonment were transferred from the KGB and later the FSB to the jurisdiction of the Federal Penitentiary Service. And now it's a comeback. The security services will not only get back their former property, but will also build up their new system. Of course, all at the expense of billions in budget funds.
A colossal budget has been allocated. We don't yet know exactly how much, but it's clear that it will be allocated because there will not only be FSB prisons, there will also be staff. They need some kind of special personnel, some special guards, but that's not all. I just read the law there will be a special FSB convoy. So there is a convoy that's part of the Federal Penitentiary Service, but there will be a special FSB convoy. There will be separate Stolypin train cars, separate ones, not the ones used by the Federal Penitentiary Service. And not just the train cars. The law also mentions airplanes and ships. I think they'll use all of them. If the law mentions airplanes and ships that aren't at the disposal of the Federal Penitentiary Service, for example, why shouldn't the FSB get them?
It's interesting that the security service is also seeking the official return of its own pre-trial detention center, Lefortovo. Formally, it was also transferred to the Federal Penitentiary Service, but in reality, it remained under FSB control. All these new assets are supposedly being introduced to more effectively combat opponents accused of treason, espionage, or collaboration with a foreign state.
You may be against the war, but you'd be against it only within yourself, not even in your own kitchen. But somewhere deep inside, maybe just some thoughts you have when you go to bed at night, maybe something you can mutter into your pillow. You can't speak out, you can't talk about it. If you don't, then things will be more or less okay for you. This is the main message they're trying to push. That's the narrative. They aren't necessarily trying to repress everyone, they're trying to show that it's possible. We can not only send you behind bars for decades, we can kill you. And that's probably, well, just the limit. In other words, there's nowhere further to go from here. The only thing left, probably, is public executions there on Red Square at the Lobnoe Mesto. Maybe we haven't reached that point yet, but we've almost hit rock bottom.
Another power that the FSB will be granted is the investigation and punishment of those who violate the order. In other words, the investigator from the investigative committee and FSIN officers are completely removed from the fate of the detainee. From the moment their hands are tied, the suspect is completely in the hands of the security services. Although in reality all of this already exists and applies to prisoners of war and Ukrainian civilians who have been captured. After the full-scale invasion, entire prison blocks in Russian prisons have appeared that are run by FSB officers.
One can imagine that under this pretext they will not only take over Lefortovo, but for example also legalize their filtration camps. And these terrifying prisons for Ukrainians. And now these will become FSB detention centers, where not a single ray of daylight will ever penetrate. Even now, no light gets in there, because these are non-existent entities. That is, they kind of don't exist. So what goes on in there, well, whoever makes it out alive tells the story. And who knows if they're really telling the truth, or if they've already lost their mind from everything they've been through. Or maybe they want to legalize them. With this system, you can process quite a lot of people. That's true. That's true. A lot of people from, so to speak, the border areas, the frontline zones, from the so-called new subjects of the Russian Federation have gone through them. This is perhaps a system, so to speak, of filtration. This is probably the worst thing happening to the formal law enforcement system of the Russian Federation, because A, it's on a massive scale, B, it's completely outside the law. You see, no matter how many torture chambers or terrible penal colonies or detention centers with bad reputations we have, lawyers still go there. letters still come out of there. You can still send a care package there, you can visit for a meeting. Well, there is some kind of management that is known, there is an address you can write to, you can complain about them after all. Maybe nothing will come of it, or maybe something will, like in the case of Anya Zhovleva, something did happen. But these pits in the ground, these barracks in unknown locations, that's complete darkness.
But ordinary Russians, wherever they are, shouldn't let their guard down. The authorities, who nostalgically recall Stalin, are preparing for the largest purges in modern history. Better to break the ribs of 100 innocent people than to let one guilty person go free. With this credo, the FSB's predecessors practiced on their fellow citizens not so long ago.
Instability breeds instability. Russia's war against Ukraine proves it. And here's the key word: reaction. If the world does not finally react to the Kremlin's actions, war crimes, then others might follow its example. China, for instance, is rapidly growing its military to prepare for a possible invasion of Taiwan. That's according to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, speaking alongside German Chancellor Merz. He said that by 2030, China will have 1,000 nuclear warheads and 100 more warships. Details in the next story.
Even more weapons. China is rapidly increasing its military capabilities, including its nuclear arsenal. But China's military buildup is not just for show. In Beijing, the main goal is to establish control over Taiwan, said NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte.
We see that China is quickly expanding its armed forces. Right now they have more ships at sea than the United States. By 2030 they'll have another 100. Currently they have 1,000 nuclear warheads, and they're meant to be used.
China considers Taiwan its territory and has promised to reunite with it at some point, not ruling out the use of force. The United States has warned that the head of the PRC has given the Chinese armed forces until 2027 to be fully prepared for an invasion of Taiwan.
According to Chinese law, Taiwan is considered part of China. For a long time, they officially rejected the use of force to establish control over Taiwan. However, overall, recently the likelihood of such forceful actions has become more and more probable. In a situation where the global system of checks and balances has essentially been disrupted, and there is a general global confrontation in the world, I believe the probability of this is high, and China is clearly considering such a scenario as more than realistic.
Rutte also reiterated his recent statement that if Xi Jinping decides to attack Taiwan, he will first ask Putin to attack NATO member countries in Europe.
Russia would start a local military conflict against NATO, for example, in the Baltic states. In this way, it would draw all of the West's attention to itself. And at the same time, China would carry out its own military operation against Taiwan, thus taking advantage of the opportunity for this war, so to speak, to be fought on two fronts simultaneously around the world.
The PRC continues to maintain active contacts with Moscow. The leaders of the two countries, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, have met many times and signed a strategic partnership agreement. Therefore, it is quite possible that the Kremlin will agree to help Beijing.
I think there are a whole range of reasons behind this. Because on the one hand, Moscow is very dependent on China. And Putin, in principle, is hardly in a position to say no at all. But besides that, I think Moscow itself may actually view this plan quite positively, because it has its own plans, its own goals. And one of the main goals is to undermine the unity of the NATO bloc, to demonstrate NATO's weakness in order to free its own hands for aggressive actions in Europe.
The crisis between Beijing and Taipei has been going on for a very long time. The PRC considers democratically governed Taiwan to be its territory, but the government of Taiwan rejects Beijing's claims and states that only its people can decide their own future.
The formation of Taiwan as a kind of independent, politically autonomous entity is connected to the events following World War II, when the communists seized power in China as a result of the Civil War. Naturally, this takeover was not legitimate in any way. It was not the result of any elections or anything like that. There was simply a civil war, and the communists won. And the government of Chiang Kai-shek, which at the time of the end of World War II was essentially the only legitimate government of China, evacuated to Taiwan and continued its existence there. And over time, all of this somehow persisted and became established. However, for example, neither the United States nor the majority of countries in the world recognize Taiwan as an independent state.
Relations between Taiwan and China became even more strained after Lai Ching-te was elected president of the island last year. He has taken a tougher stance toward the PRC compared to his predecessor, including strengthening Taiwan's armed forces. On Wednesday, the 9th of July, the annual Han Kuang military exercises began in Taiwan. They will last 10 days, which is twice as long as usual, and will involve more than 20,000 reservists as well as civilians. Although the main goal of the exercises is to prepare Taiwan's population and military for a possible attack, they are also intended to publicly demonstrate the island's defensive capabilities and send a clear signal to Beijing.
The aim here is not so much to show power and strength, but rather the unity of Taiwan with its potential allies, chief among them, of course, the United States. So I think that's the main goal, the main objective, to show that, look, we are together with our allies, we are not alone, and if anything happens, we have someone to rely on. So please don't count on us being left alone to face your potential invasion.
In addition to the drills, in recent years, Taiwan has also extended the duration of mandatory military service and begun developing and producing its own submarines and missiles.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you for your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment and share. See you next time.